Starting out the article in line A, I'm making an inference. The author at some point in the article will be talking about running into an old friend, as well as synthesizing. I'm curious as to where the author and the friend met, as well as if the friend's a boy or girl, how long they've known each other, and why they haven't seen each other in quite some time. In line B here, I'm making an inference that the author of the article is Beth T. Lewis. In line 1, starting the article, I am making an inference. When the author says, in quotes, reading an absorbing story, she refers to a story that is similar to your life and is something that is meaningful to you as well as has happened to you. In line 2, I make a connection. The author says, when the sight of a beloved book takes me back to places. At that point, I made a connection because I love reading Harry Potter. And whenever I see them on a shelf somewhere, it reminds me of when I read them as a kid, as well as gets me excited to buy them so that I can put them in my future classroom. In line 3, I made a connection. I shop at thrift stores all the time, especially for books for my future classroom. And I'm also thinking critically. I agree that books in a thrift store look like, in quotes, a seamless mass that is never ending. This can be overwhelming to look at, and sometimes just have to look at it and walk away due to the overwhelmingness that it can have. In line 4, I am synthesizing. I'm curious as to what book she saw with a goldenrod spine, as well as making a connection. I read books with goldenrod spines all the time, so I'm curious as to see what one she read and if it's something familiar to what I read as a child. And then in lines 5 and 6, I'm remembering information and making predictions. In this one, the remembering information comes from remembering the title, running into an old friend. After remembering that, I am making a prediction that the old friend is a book rather than a person instead. In line 7 here, this part is an excerpt from the book Caddy Woodlawn. I also am able to make a connection because I was a tomboy growing up, as well as the character Caddy Woodlawn was when she was growing up. In line 8, I'm making an inference. The book Caddy Woodlawn was a book the author read multiple times growing up and is very familiar with. In line 9, I also make an inference. The author feels like she has become part of the story, Caddy Woodlawn, due to how often she read it and the familiarity she has with it. In line 10, I am making a connection. I read recently in an article at school about carrier pigeons. In the article, it talked about how it saved a troop from a war due to the fact that they were getting attacked by their own team. So it was interesting to make that connection and see how messages were sent by pigeons rather than cell phones or computers. In line 11, I also make a connection. I wasn't the child that liked to put on dresses and be all prim and proper like the author says as well. And then I also am making an inference. I believe that the author was a tomboy growing up as well. In line 12, I am synthesizing. I'm wondering if the author grew up where the story took place or if it's maybe based partly on her story due to the similarities they have. In line 13, I am making an inference. The old friend mentioned in the title is possibly talking about Caddy from the story Caddy and Woodlawn instead of being a person. And in line 14, I'm rereading. Here I reread the line multiple times in order to understand how the author felt rereading a story she grew up with. She mentions that, her quote in the article prompted recollections, the way familiar tastes and smells spontaneously revive memories, is a great way to mention how you were feeling. And it's great descriptive words rather than saying that you were feeling happy or sad or the basic words that we typically use. And in lines 15 and 16, here I made an inference. While reading the book, the author, Beth T. Lewis, felt like a child again and reflected back to her childhood when she was reading the book Caddy Woodlawn. Lines 17 through 19 I grouped together due to the fact that I think they fit very well together. Here I made the connection. I had a teacher give me a book suggestions based off stories I was interested in, just like Beth T. Lewis had when she was growing up, as well as solving words. When the word incinerator appeared, I initially skipped over it due to not being able to pronounce it right away. After rereading and sounding out the letters in the word, I was able to pronounce the word and better understand the sentence it was used in due to knowing what an incinerator was. I also grouped lines 20 through 23 together. I thought that due to where the sentences ended and whatnot, it was perfect to just group them together and mention all of my think alouds in one. So with these four sentences, I made a connection. I loved being outdoors as a child rather than inside. I'm also thinking critically. I agree that people can connect to characters in a story they are reading due to the similarities between themselves and the character in the story, as well as synthesizing. I am curious as to if the author grew up in the same area as Caddy Woodlawn or where that took place. In line 24, I made a connection. I had a teacher that I had for fourth and fifth grade, just like how Beth T. Lewis had a teacher for third and fourth grade. In line 25, I am synthesizing. I'm curious as to what the frontier days are, so that'd be something interesting to look up. In line 26, I'm monitoring and checking. As I read, I saw the word lie. I read it a few times, double checked pronunciation with a friend, and then looked up the definition so I knew what the word meant and was able to apply it into the sentence. I also, excuse me, I also am synthesizing because I was curious as to what lye soap meant, and this was before I had researched it. And then I also would be adjusting my pace. When I came to the word, I was kind of confused and just kept going. However, I slowed down and reread the sentence in order to see what lye soap was. And then without knowing what it was based off the reading, I then proceeded to look it up and find more information that way. In line 27, I'm synthesizing because I'm curious as to what omni means, as well as rereading. I reread how the author's teacher channeled their interest into reading time, which I thought was a really cool aspect. I think having the students pick their favorite books and having their interest in those books is a great way to get students to be able to read. In lines 28 and 29, I made a connection. I also had a cozy reading area in the classroom that I grew up in, so it was a lot easier to read, as well as thinking critically. I like that the author's teacher uses omni or all reading so that each and every student is engaged in their reading. Lines 30 and 31, I synthesized here. The author mentions that she would get Saturday trips to the library taken away compared to hanging out with friends. And I'm curious as if she didn't necessarily have a lot of friends or if she didn't enjoy being with them. Also, why did she like reading more than playing with friends? In line 32, I'm thinking critically. I like that the author enjoyed reading enough to want to do it all day in school. However, I disagree with wanting to do it all day in school because I liked other subjects. And I'm also curious and synthesizing if the author just didn't enjoy other subjects or enjoy being at school in general. In lines 33 through 35, I synthesized because I'm wondering why the author felt connected to Caddy, as well as thinking critically. I agree that it doesn't matter what interests you as long as it, in quotes, nurtured and given the chance to develop into experience. I think that's a great way for students to continue their interests and make connections with them and get them excited to learn more about them. And I made a connection in these three sentences. I also enhanced my childhood through my favorite stories, like Harry Potter being one. In lines 36 through 38, I made an inference. I infer that Caddy helped grow the love of reading in Beth T. Lewis. I'm making a connection. I also love rereading old favorite books that I find at thrift stores. I connected to the author when she said, the memories that are created are just as powerful as those of actual adventures. And the second I read that, it made me think of one of my favorite quotes by my favorite author, J.K. Rowling, who wrote the Harry Potter series. And it states, whether you come back by page or by big screen, Hogwarts will always be there to welcome you home. I think that's a great quote because it's a familiar story to you. It's one of my favorite stories, and it's just reassuring that whenever you go back to the book or the movie, it's always there for you and is welcoming you home. In line 39 here, I'm making a connection to the author because I also am getting my master's degree. I'm synthesizing because I'm curious as to why this part was added to the article, but I'm also inferring that it was added because it allows readers to know where the author is located and just a little bit about herself. In line 40 here, the last line, I'm synthesizing because I'm curious as to what the book Caddy Woodlawn is about based off what the author gave us in the article. I kind of want to know a little bit more about the book. And I'm also making an inference that the author cited the book mentioned in the article because one, she has to cite the book, so it's not plagiarism. And it's also a way for readers to know information about the book and kind of where to find it so that in hopes they can track it down and read it for themselves.